The smell of pine needles and campfire smoke has always been a comfort to me. My grandparents owned a cabin up in the mountains, and some of my happiest memories are from summers spent there with them, my cousins, and my little sister Emily. It was a world away from the suburbs, a place where adventure lay around every mossy bend in the trail. Unfortunately, those idyllic summers ended when Gran passed away. Grandpa tried to keep it up for a while, but he was just one old man trying to wrangle 5 grandkids, and it was too much for him. The cabin sat untouched most years after that, except for the occasional weekend when my dad would take us out there to clear brush or fix whatever had broken over the winter. I was 14 the summer I begged him to go again. It was less about the cabin itself, and more about that feeling of wildness and freedom it represented. I craved the crisp air, the sound of the creek out back, the nights so dark the stars seemed to blanket the entire sky. No way, it's too run down, Dad argued. It might not even be safe. But I whined and pleaded and promised to help with repairs, and finally, Dad caved. I practically threw myself into packing, barely able to contain my excitement as we bumped along the dirt road toward the cabin. Emily, a mere 9 years old, just giggled and bounced on the seat beside me, her eyes just as bright as mine. When we arrived, it looked exactly how I remembered. Weathered, a little forlorn, but still our own private wonderland. I breathed in the pine-scented air and grinned. This was going to be amazing. The first night, though, my excitement faded a little. Despite helping Dad with some basic repairs, there was still a lot of work to be done. The creaking floorboards, the leaky roof in the back room, the musty smell that seemed to seep into every corner. It wasn't quite the fairy tale retreat of my memories. But by the next morning, the thrill was back. After making a quick breakfast using the camping stove, the regular one hadn't worked in years, Emily and I laced up our hiking boots and set off exploring. We'd always been told to stay on the main trails, but who were we kidding? We were going off-road. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, but we made our own way, laughing and swatting away branches. I half expected to see one of our cousins running ahead, just like we used to. Finally, we found it, a small, sun-dappled clearing with a fallen log we'd used as a pretend pirate ship 100 times before. We perched ourselves on the mossy remains, basking in the familiar joy of our secret hideaway. That's when I heard it. A noise that wasn't an animal. It sounded too deliberate, like a football maybe. I froze, and Emily's chatter stopped mid-sentence. "Hey, what's wrong?" she whispered, her eyes now wide. "Shh." Instinctively, I grabbed her hand and pulled her off the log. We ducked behind a giant oak tree, my heart pounding a frantic tattoo against my ribs. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Peeking out from behind the tree, I saw him. It was a man, dressed in tattered clothes, his face obscured by a wild tangle of beard and hair. He was standing a short distance away, staring directly at our old log. A wave of unease washed over me as he tilted his head, almost as if listening. Whispering urgently to Emily, we backed away as quietly as we could. It felt like an eternity before we made it back to the trail, where we broke into a desperate run. Back at the cabin, breathless and shaking, I finally told Dad. His face turned grim, and he went to inspect the old shotgun he kept above the door. The rest of the weekend was a blur. We stayed indoors, keeping the doors locked. Dad constantly went outside, patrolling the property line, his gaze sweeping the tree line with a tense, hunted expression. The night before we were supposed to leave, I woke up with a gasp. Emily was whimpering from her makeshift bed on the floor beside me. The window overlooking the woods was open, and a chill wind was blowing in, rustling the curtains. An overwhelming feeling of wrongness filled the room. Outside, I could just make out the silhouette of the man, standing perfectly still, staring up at us. I screamed. Dad burst into the room, shotgun in hand. The man disappeared back into the shadows before Dad even got to the window. We left the next morning, earlier than planned. Neither Emily nor I protested. I've never been back to the cabin since. Sometimes I wish I could, and that I hadn't let that man taint a place I once loved. But mostly now, I remember that feeling of being watched, the knowledge that we weren't alone in those woods. No summer adventure could ever erase that chilly memory, and I'm just glad that we didn't get caught on the trails like in a thunderstorm, giving that man more of an opportunity to kidnap us. Let me be straight with you. I hate the ocean. I grew up on the coast, so the beach was always there, an unavoidable part of life. But those endless blue waves, the things you can't see beneath the surface, they fill me with a deep primal dread. My friends used to tease me about it, call me a landlubber. It wasn't until last summer, though, that they finally understood. My college roommate, Jenna, is the complete opposite of me. She's a fearless surfer chick, spends every free moment either in the water or on the sand with those bleach blonde hair extensions whipping in the breeze. Jenna is also my best friend, so when she planned a weekend getaway to her parents' beach house, I reluctantly agreed to go. The beach house was just as I remembered from other visits. Stilted, weathered wood, the sound of the surf an ever-present backdrop. It was late summer, and a heavy storm had been rolling in for days. Jenna, however, was thrilled. "Epic waves!" she kept exclaiming, her eyes glittering with excitement. Me? I huddled inside, the smell of salt and dampness making my stomach churn. That first night, the storm unleashed its fury. From my upstairs window, I watched the ocean turn into a churning black monster, waves crashing against the shore like angry fists. Rain lashed down, obscuring everything but the occasional blinding flash of lightning. Sleep seemed impossible, and every creak of the old house, every gust of wind, sent my anxiety spiraling. The next morning the storm still raged, but it had lost some of its intensity. Jenna, of course, was out on the porch, rain dripping from her hair, a goofy smile on her face as she waxed up her surfboard. "Come on, it's not so bad out," she yelled over the din. I shook my head vigorously, retreating further into the house. A few hours later, bored and restless, I peeked out again. The rain was less intense now, and Jenna was still out there, a tiny figure riding the waves. Annoyed with myself, I decided a walk on the beach might help settle my nerves. The sand was cold and damp under my bare feet, but the worst of the storm seemed to have passed. There was a strange stillness to the air, though. Jenna was now just a speck far out on the horizon. Suddenly, the hair on my arms prickled. I was no longer alone on the beach. There was a figure standing at the water's edge maybe 100 yards away. It was hunched over, the wind tugging at the dark shape of its clothing. Just an observer, I told myself. Probably someone who also lived in one of the beach houses, lured out by the waning storm. But something about the figure struck a deeply discordant note within me. It had an air of stillness that seemed unnatural against the backdrop of swirling clouds and crashing waves. I was about to turn back when it moved. Its head lifted, and it turned in my direction. In that instant, I knew, without logic or reason, that it wasn't human. It was too tall, too thin. Its movements fluid in a way that sent ice shooting through my veins. It stood there, facing me, its shape impossibly black against the pale gray sky. I bolted. My retreat back to the house was a blur. Slamming the door, I fumbled for the lock, my fingers shaking. Jenna appeared behind me, startled. "Hey, what's wrong? You're soaking wet." I tried to explain, my voice choked. It saw me. It knows I'm here. Jenna gave me an exasperated sigh. "Saw who? You're starting to creep me out," she said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. We made a fire and huddled together for warmth, watching the storm rage outside. We were still alone. Jenna is a good surfer. She knows the ocean's mood, the rhythms of the tide. The next morning, she was still confident enough to declare the conditions ideal. But now, remembering the impossible shape on the beach, I couldn't bring myself to let her go alone. I told her about the storm, the figure, the cold feeling still lingering in my bones. Jenna looked at me, and her usual easygoing smile faltered a little. "Listen, maybe we should," she began. But before she could finish, there was a knock at the door. It was a Coast Guard officer, his face grim. "There's been an accident. We believe it was your friend," he said. Jenna collapsed, her sobs mingling with the sound of the storm. No body was ever found. They say it was the undertow, the unpredictable tides. But I know. I saw something out on that beach, something that no sane person should ever see. And in those endless waves, I see it still. The sea is no place for humans. It hides things, monstrous things, that wait for the unwary, the ones who, unlike me, don't fear the water's depths. My son Ethan loved the outdoors. Even as a 4-year-old, he could rattle off facts about trees and birds that would amaze you. So, after weeks of him begging, I finally agreed to take him on a real hike. Not just some path in the city park, but a trail tucked away in the hills where he could find salamanders and maybe a wild mushroom or two. We packed our bags, snacks, water, a little first aid kit, and set off with the kind of excitement only a nature-bound kid and a slightly worried dad can muster. The trail was a bit narrower and steeper than I'd remembered, but Ethan didn't seem to mind. He scrambled over rocks like a little mountain goat, filling his pockets with strange leaves and acorns. We were having the time of our lives, though until we weren't. I'm not sure how it happened. Maybe we lingered too long watching a bright blue jay, or took a wrong turn at an unmarked fork in the path. One minute, we were sure of ourselves, and the next, we were hopelessly lost. Ethan, usually so full of chatter, grew quiet, his little face pale. "Dad, which way is home?" Don't worry, buddy." I tried to sound confident, but my pulse pounded like a tribal drum. The sun was sinking, casting eerie, long shadows across the forest floor. We tried backtracking, taking side paths, only to find ourselves deeper in the tangle of trees. Then the sky darkened. Not the slow, fading light of dusk, but an ominous, storm-promising gray. Thunder, distant at first, began to growl closer. Ethan whimpered, and my heart sank. This wasn't cute anymore. This wasn't an adventure. A flash of lightning seared the sky, so close it seemed to crack the world open. Rain followed, not drizzle, but sheets of icy water drenching us in seconds. We huddled under a massive oak tree, inadequate shelter against the onslaught. Ethan, usually so brave, began to cry, his little body shivering uncontrollably. I did the only thing I could think of. I pulled him tight and told him stories. Not the nature ones, stories about home, about his favorite toys, and about warm blankets and his mom waiting for us. I didn't know if it would soothe him, but I needed the sound of my own voice against the roaring storm. And then, like a miracle, a flicker of light through the trees. Not lightning this time, but the steady beam of a flashlight. Yelling, waving, the desperation of a drowning man, and a voice cut through the rain. "Anyone there? Hello?" A search party, bless them. Relief washed over me in a warm wave, so strong I almost buckled. Ethan and I were going to be okay. And Cinco de Mayo, well, I figured we'd have plenty to celebrate from now on.